Hey, what's up, guys? I'm finally back, and today I'm going to be covering Meditation 5 concerning the essence of material things and again concerning God, that He exists. Okay, so by the title, you can already tell that Descartes is already going to look at the essences of material things, and he's going to provide us his second proof for God's existence, which is one of the most famous arguments as well. And so, Descartes' immediate goal is to free himself from doubt and determine whether anything certain can be known about material things, which are things that are external to him, right? And so before he can even examine whether they actually exist, he has to find out how they exist as ideas in the mind. So he has a clear and distinct idea of quantity, which is the continuous extension of material things in space. So this quantity has length, breadth, depth, and being divisible into parts. He also assigns to these parts sizes of varying, right? And shapes, positions, and movements. And he also says that time can be attributed to movement because it is a duration. Okay, so the nature of material things is best understood through mathematical reasoning, which reveals eternal truths, like 1 plus 1 equals 2. He also says that mathematical and geometrical truths are not learned from experience, but are discovered within oneself. And when he is focused on such ideas, he is like recalling knowledge rather than learning something new for the first time. Kind of like a Platonist, right? Like how Plato understood knowledge, right? Even though Descartes is not a Platonist, right? And so these ideas have been present with him all along. Like they've been inside of him, right? They're innate. And so remember, Descartes is a rationalist. He does believe in innate ideas. Okay, so with this, he claims that ideas like of triangles, numbers, and geometric shapes or figures have their own true eternal nature that is immutable. These truths do not depend on his mind because he can't really alter them or really create them. And when he conceives or imagines a triangle, it has a fixed nature. So that basically means that when you conceive of a triangle, the three angles add up to two right angles. The longest side is opposite the largest angle. These properties exist independently of whether a triangle exists in reality, right? And Descartes also rejects that these ideas could have come from experience or sense data, because even if he has seen like certain shapes in the world, like triangles or like a pentagon, he can just conceive of countless other figures, geometric figures that he has never seen, and he can demonstrate properties of these figures purely through reason. This proves that these mathematical truths are not derived from the senses, but exist as abstract truths in the mind. And remember that everything that is clearly and distinctly perceived must be true. So Descartes knows geometric properties with certainty, and he knows they are true. Now, this is the big part. He is going to take this one big step and apply the same reasoning about mathematics to God. And so Descartes says that the idea of God as a supremely perfect being is found within his mind, just like the idea of a triangle or a number. Just as a triangle necessarily has three angles adding up to two right angles, God necessarily exists because existence is part of his essence, or namely existence is his essence via actus purus. Now, the proof of God. So this is how he sets up his second proof, or this is kind of oversimplified, but just simplified, right? So God is defined as a being with all perfections. Existence is a perfection. Therefore, God must exist. Now, even if he were to doubt all his previous meditations, the existence of God is as certain as mathematical truths. So an initial objection pops up to mind, and this argument might appear deceptive or circular, kind of like a sophistic argument. And some people might question, like, or object, saying we can separate existence from essence. For example, a horse does not necessarily have to exist just because we can think of it. This makes it easy to assume that existence can be separated from God's essence as well. But no, Descartes says that's not the case here, because if you pay more close attention, it becomes clear that existence is inseparable from the essence of a supremely perfect being. In other beings, essence is separable from existence, and they can only potentially exist, like that of a phoenix bird. And if it were to actually exist, then it would move from potential to actual, which requires an efficient cause, or namely another cause. And so, but God is pure act, and his essence is to be, or namely to exist. And so Descartes gives us an analogy. Consider the example of a mountain and a valley. They are inseparable in thought, because one cannot think of a mountain without also thinking of a valley. However, this does not mean that a mountain must actually exist in reality. And though one might question that just because he cannot think of God without existence, it does not mean that God actually exists. But Descartes says, and formulates an important distinction. And he says that the mountain valley analogy does not work because the existence of a mountain is not a part of its essence. So it's not directly like, I guess it doesn't represent God fully, basically. But in the case of God, God is different, right? Because existence is a part of God's essence, or God's essence is to be, God's essence is existence itself. In the same way that having 3 angles is part of a triangle's essence, just as a triangle necessarily has 3 angles adding up to 2 right angles, God necessarily contains existence. Existence is a perfection. And so essence is the what it was to be that thing, the Aristotelian definition, or you can say the whatness or quiddity of that thing. And existence is that a thing is, or whether something actually exists in reality. And so this is Descartes' famous ontological argument. And remember, these are arguments trying to prove God as a priori, or knowledge independent of empirical justification. It's a philosophical argument stating that God must exist because existence is a necessary property of a supremely perfect being. And back to the mountain and valley analogy, it is true that one cannot conceive of a mountain without a valley, but this does not mean that a mountain and a valley necessarily exist in reality. However, like again, with God the situation is different, because when you conceive of God, you have to conceive of him as actually existing, because existence is a part of God's essence, whereas the concept of a mountain does not include existence as part of its nature, because a mountain can only potentially exist, not actually. And so Descartes clarifies to us that it is not the act of thinking about God that brings about his existence, but it is the necessity of God's existence that imposes itself upon our thinking, because God's essence includes existence, making his non-existence practically impossible. Now, some might counter by trying to say, well, just because we, ascribe or define God as having existence, or we ascribe existence to God when we define him as a supremely perfect being, it doesn't actually mean we had to define him that way in the first place. But Descartes refutes this by giving another analogy. Consider the example. One does not have to consider a four-sided figure in relation to a circle. However, if one does consider a three-sided figure, which is a triangle, one must recognize that its angles add up to 2 right angles. Likewise, while one is not forced to think of God, if one does, they have to necessarily conceive of him as existing. Because whenever one thinks of God as first and supreme, one necessarily attributes all perfections to him, and even if you can't think of all perfections, it's all inherently united in God, because God is ultimately simple. And one of these perfections is existence. Now, this argument is analogous to the way certain geometrical truths, like the sum of angles in a triangle, they are necessarily true even if someone is not thinking about them at any given moment. 1 plus 1 is still equal to 2 even if I don't think about it, right? And so there's a major difference between false assumptions and true ideas. And so false assumptions arise when people do not restrict themselves to what they clearly and distinctly understand. True ideas, like that of God, are not inventions of thought, but rather reflections of immutable eternal truths. And so Descartes also argues that God is the only being that has existence necessarily tied to his essence, and there cannot be multiple gods of this nature. And once one acknowledges the existence of such a being, it follows then necessarily that he has existed eternally and will always continue to exist eternally. Now, only things that fully convince Descartes are those he perceives clearly and distinctly. Some truths are self-evident to everyone, for example, basic geometric properties, while others require careful inquiry. And so once a truth is discovered, it is as certain as those that are obvious from the start. So consider the example of the Pythagorean theorem. It's not immediately obvious, right? Maybe for the first time you learned it, but once it is proven, it is as undeniable as the fact that the hypotenuse is opposite of the largest angle. And Descartes says that if he were not engulfed by his prejudices or distracted by sensory images, he would recognize God's existence as the most evident truth of all, because the existence of a supreme being should be more self-evident than anything else. But obviously human biases and reliance on sensory perception weaken this recognition. And so Descartes concludes that the certainty of all other knowledge depends on the certainty of God's existence. Without acknowledging God, nothing can be perfectly known. Since God guarantees the reliability of clear and distinct perceptions, certainty about anything else, for example, mathematics, external reality, natural science, ultimately rests on this foundation. And although there is a limitation, right, he can't always keep his attention focused on the same thing, and due to this, even if he had previously judged something to be true, he might later on doubt it when he is no longer, focusing on it or attending to the reasoning that led him to that judgment. Consider that humans have often believed things to be true and later turned out to be false. This raises the problem that even seemingly clear and distinct perceptions could be mistaken. And Descartes understands that God exists and is not a deceiver, because it is impossible for God to be a deceiver. And so he reaches a crucial conclusion, which we have already repeated. Everything he clearly and distinctly perceives has to be true, must be true. Even if he later forgets the exact reasoning behind some truth, but as long as he remembers that he perceived it clearly and distinctly, he knows it must be true. This applies not only to this specific example like geometry, but to all knowledge he has demonstrated through clear and distinct perception. And Descartes goes on to refute possible objections. So the first objection is that you are often mistaken. And he says, in response to this, that he now knows that he cannot be mistaken in matters he plainly understands. And the second objection is that you have taken things to be true before that you later found to be false. And so Descartes answers that those false beliefs were never things he clearly and distinctly perceived. Instead, he had believed them for reasons that were later discovered to be unreliable or dubitable. Now, objection 3, perhaps you are dreaming. And Descartes says that even if he were dreaming, the fact remains that whatever is evident to his intellect must be true. For example, even if he was dreaming, mathematical truths like 1 plus 1 is still going to equal to 2, and that a triangle has 3 angles. Dreams do not change the nature of clear and distinct perception. And so Descartes concludes that the certainty and truth of all sciences are going to depend exclusively and uniquely on the knowledge of the true God. Namely, because Descartes is a Catholic, so he believes in the Trinity. And so prior to knowing God, he was incapable of achieving perfect knowledge about anything, right? Because remember, in the prior meditations, if he hadn't established that God exists, then truly nothing could ever be certain, and that mathematical truths just get absolutely demolished. Now, he understands that God's existence and nature. And so with this, he is going to be able to achieve full and certain knowledge about God, about intellectual matters, about corporal, which is physical or physical nature, and particularly in relation to pure mathematics. And so his clear and distinct perceptions are going to be true and reliable. And with God, external objects, he has a justification for why external objects exist in the world. The providence of God promising the world will work in an orderly fashion, right? And that is the end of Meditation 5.